The estate at Yasnaya Polyana sat low in the Tula province, about 130 miles south of Moscow, in a landscape of birch groves and wide fields and the kind of quiet that feels older than the buildings that interrupt it. The house itself was not grand by the standards of the Russian aristocracy. 2 stories, white columns, green roof, surrounded by orchards and lime trees, and a long approach through gates that opened onto nothing more dramatic than the plain fact of rural life continuing as it always had. In the summer of 1837, a boy of 9 years old was living there, already an orphan, already shaped by absence. His mother had died when he was not yet 2. His father had died when he was 9. He had been passed into the care of relatives, and the estate had passed with him, a kind of anchor he would never fully escape and never fully inhabit, a place that would recur in his work like a heartbeat, sometimes visible, sometimes not, but always there beneath the surface. His name was Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy, though the world would come to know him as Leo, and he would live at Yasnaya Polyana, on and off, for most of his 82 years. He would write there, marry there, raise 13 children there, and try, in the last decades of his life, to transform himself there into something his earlier self would not have recognized. But in 1837 he was simply a boy in a house that had recently become quieter, trying to make sense of a world that had already taken more from him than he could yet understand. He had been born on August 28, 1828, the 4th of 5 children, into a family that carried the weight of old Russian nobility, without the accompanying wealth to make that weight comfortable. The Tolstoys were an ancient family, traceable back through centuries, but by the time Lev was born, the estate was encumbered with debts, the serfs numerous, but the management lax, the whole enterprise operating under the long shadow of a social order that was already beginning to show cracks, even if no one could yet imagine what would replace it. His father, Nikolai Ilyich, was a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars, a man of some charm and less ambition, who had married Lev's mother Maria Volkonskaya, in part because her inheritance might steady the family finances. She came from the Volkonsky line, a family even older and more distinguished than the Tolstoys, and she brought with her the estate at Yasnaya Polyana and 800 serfs. Lev would not remember his mother's face. She died when he was a year and 8 months old, and he would spend much of his later life trying to reconstruct her from the memories of others, from letters, from the few stories that survived her. In his autobiographical works he would write about the idea of her more than the fact of her, the sense of her presence that had been warm and attentive, and then was gone, leaving behind a feeling he could not name, but also could not forget. His father remarried briefly, or rather, there was a woman in the house for a time, but Nikolai Ilyich died in 1837 on a trip to Tula, suddenly and without warning, and the children were left in the care of their father's cousin, Tatiana Ergolskaya, who loved them with a fierce, self-effacing devotion, and then, after her, a more distant relative, the Countess Alexandra Ostensakin, who took them to Kazan when Lev was 13. The early education was erratic. There were tutors, some of them competent, some of them less so. There was a German tutor named Fyodor Ivanovich Russell, who appears in Tolstoy's autobiographical childhood under a different name, rendered with a mix of affection and mild ridicule. There was a French tutor, and later a Russian tutor, who tried to instill some sense of discipline, though Lev was not a naturally disciplined student. He read widely and chaotically Pushkin, French novels, the Gospels, Rousseau, whom he would carry with him like a talisman for the rest of his life. He was drawn to the idea of the noble savage, the uncorrupted natural man, and he was also drawn to the idea of self-perfection, of constructing oneself, according to a set of principles that could be written down and followed. He kept lists. He wrote rules for himself. He tried to measure his progress toward some ideal version of Lev Tolstoy that existed only in his imagination, and he failed repeatedly, and he wrote down the failures too, with a kind of grim satisfaction, as though the act of recording the failure was itself a step toward improvement. He was not a beautiful child. His ears stuck out. His nose was broad and his face wide and his eyes set deep, and he was aware of this in the way that children are aware of the ways they do not match the world's preferred shapes. He was sensitive and proud and given to intense, short-lived enthusiasms. He loved his older brothers, Nikolai and Sergei, with a fervor that bordered on worship. He loved his sister Maria and his youngest brother, Dmitri, though Dmitri was strange and devout in a way that unsettled the others. The five of them lived in a world that was contracting and expanding at once contracting because of the deaths that had reduced their immediate family to almost nothing, expanding because the estate was a kind of universe, populated by serfs whose lives intersected with theirs in ways that were intimate and incomprehensible, whose labor made their lives possible, but whose inner lives remained largely invisible to the children of the house. This was the contradiction he was born into, and it would follow him for the rest of his life. He was a member of the ruling class in a society built on the ownership of human beings. The serfs at Yasnaya Polyana, and later at other estates, were not slaves in the legal sense that an American would have understood the term in 1830. But the distinction was thin. They could not leave. They could be sold, though usually they were sold with the land rather than separated from it. They owed labor to the estate, and their lives were subject to the whims and needs of the family that owned them. Lev grew up surrounded by people who served him, who cooked his food and maintained the house, and worked the fields that produced the income that kept the family afloat, and he grew up understanding, on some level, that this arrangement was not natural, that it was constructed and maintained by force and custom, and that it was also the only world he knew. He would later write in his autobiographical works and in his fiction about the strange intimacy of that world, the way the servants were more present in a child's life than the parents, the way their stories and songs and sorrows were woven into the fabric of daily life, and yet there was always a line that could not be crossed, a fundamental inequality that shaped every interaction. In Childhood, the first of his published works, written when he was in his early 20s, he renders this world with a clarity that is both affectionate and unsettling, showing the child narrator's love for his nurse and his tutor and the servants who populate the house, and also showing the casual cruelty and thoughtlessness that come naturally to a child who has been taught that some people exist to serve others. In 1841, when Lev was 13, the family moved to Kazan, where the Countess Osten-Sakin had her home. The move was meant to provide the children with better educational opportunities, and for Lev, it meant a brief period of tutoring followed by enrollment at Kazan University in 1844. He was 16. He studied languages and law, though he was not particularly interested in either. He was interested in Rousseau, in the idea of the perfectibility of man, in the notion that society corrupted the natural goodness of human beings, and that it was possible, through discipline and will, to strip away that corruption and return to something pure. He was also interested, increasingly, in the social life of the university and the minor aristocratic circles of Kazan, in drinking and gambling, and the kind of aimless carousing that seemed, at the time, like a form of freedom. He did not do well at the university. He was bored by the lectures and impatient with the requirements and inclined to think that he could educate himself better than any institution could educate him. He left without completing his degree in 1847, returning to Yasnaya Polyana with vague plans to reform the estate, to improve the lives of the serfs, to become a model landowner who would demonstrate the possibility of a more just and rational agrarian order. He was 19 years old. He believed that if he simply explained to the serfs how they could improve their own lives, if he built them better housing, if he taught them better farming methods, if he showed them the benefits of discipline and hygiene, they would eagerly embrace his vision, and the estate would be transformed. The serfs, understandably, did not embrace his vision. They were suspicious of the young master who had returned from the city with ideas, and they were not particularly interested in changing the way they had always done things, especially not on the word of a 19-year-old who had never worked the land himself. Tolstoy's attempts at reform foundered almost immediately. He grew frustrated, then disillusioned, then distracted by other things, by trips to Moscow and Petersburg, by gambling, by the ongoing project of self-improvement that he pursued with an intensity that bordered on obsession and an inconsistency that bordered on farce. He wrote in his diary constantly, recording his failures to live up to his own standards, making new lists of rules, breaking them almost immediately. He was searching for something. He did not yet know what it was, but he knew it was not in Kazan, and not in the social life of Moscow, and not in the attempt to rationalize the estate. He was searching for a form, for a way of living that would feel coherent, and he was also searching for a form of expression, though he had not yet committed himself to writing as anything more than a private exercise. He read enormously. He read Rousseau and Pushkin and Gogol and Schiller and the French novelists, and he read the Gospels, and he tried to fit all of this into some kind of framework that would explain the world and his place in it. In 1851, his older brother Nikolai, who was serving as an army officer in the Caucasus, invited Lev to join him there. Lev went, partly out of restlessness, partly out of a sense that the Caucasus might offer something adventure, clarity, a break from the aimlessness of his life. He was 22. The Caucasus at that time was a war zone, a mountainous region on the southern edge of the Russian Empire where the imperial army was engaged in a grinding, brutal campaign against the various ethnic groups. Chechens, Circassians, others who resisted Russian expansion. It was a war that had been going on for decades. It would continue for years more, a war marked by ambushes and raids and reprisals, by breathtaking landscapes and casual atrocities. Tolstoy joined the army as a junker, a kind of gentleman volunteer, and he spent the next several years moving between garrison towns and the front, participating in campaigns, and beginning, seriously, to write. The first work he completed in the Caucasus was Childhood, a short autobiographical novel that he sent to the journal The Contemporary in 1852. It was published later that year, unsigned, under the title Childhood, a Story. It was a success. Critics praised its psychological depth, its attention to the inner life of the child narrator, the way it rendered the texture of memory and feeling without sentimentality. Tolstoy was surprised by the response. He had written the work as a kind of exercise, a way of making sense of his own early life, and he had not expected it to resonate with readers. But it did, and so he kept writing. He wrote about the Caucasus, about the landscape, and the soldiers, and the strange mixture of boredom and terror that characterized military life on the frontier. He wrote The Raid, a story about a young officer's first experience of combat, and A Wood Felling, which depicted the day-to-day life of soldiers in winter quarters. He wrote with a directness and a lack of romanticism that was unusual for the time. He did not glorify war. He did not present the soldiers as heroes or the enemy as monsters. He showed men doing their jobs, sometimes bravely, sometimes not, in a landscape that was indifferent to their struggles. The stories were published in the Contemporary, and they added to his growing reputation. In 1854, the Crimean War began, and Tolstoy requested a transfer to the active front. He was sent to Sevastopol, the fortress city on the Black Sea that would become the focal point of the war between Russia and the allied forces of France, Britain, and Turkey. Sevastopol was under siege. The city was being bombarded constantly, and the conditions for soldiers and civilians were grim. Tolstoy served in the artillery, and he was stationed at the 4th Bastion, one of the most dangerous positions, where the risk of death was not abstract but immediate and daily. He kept a diary, he wrote letters, and he wrote a series of sketches that would be published as the Sevastopol Sketches, 3 pieces that described the siege from different perspectives and at different stages. The Sevastopol sketches are unlike almost anything else written about war up to that point. They are not narratives in the traditional sense. They are observations, rendered in the second person, as though the reader is walking through the city alongside the narrator, seeing what he sees, the wounded men in the hospital, the soldiers in the bastion, the bodies in the streets, the strange way life continues, even in the midst of destruction. The first sketch, Sevastopol in December, was published in the Contemporary in 1855 and caused a sensation. It was read aloud in the Winter Palace. The Tsar himself is said to have read it, and to have ordered that Tolstoy be kept out of danger, though the order, if it was given, was not particularly effective. The second sketch, Sevastopol in May, was more critical, more explicit in its depiction of the incompetence and vanity of the officer class, and it ran into trouble with the censors. The third, Sevastopol in August, was written after the fall of the city, after the Russian forces had abandoned the ruins and retreated, and it is the darkest of the three, suffused with a sense of waste and futility. Tolstoy had seen enough. He had been in combat, he had been under fire, he had seen men die for reasons that had nothing to do with valor or necessity, and everything to do with the blunders of their commanders. He had come to the conclusion that war was not glorious, that it was not even particularly meaningful, that it was simply a form of organized chaos in which men suffered and died, and the suffering and dying were justified by appeals to abstractions, honor, duty, the motherland that dissolved under any kind of scrutiny. This disillusionment would become one of the central themes of his mature work, but in 1855 it was still raw and unprocessed. He left the army in 1856 at the age of 27 and returned to Petersburg as a literary celebrity. The Sevastopol sketches had made him famous. He was invited into the literary circles of the capital, where he met Turgenev and Goncharov and the other writers associated with the contemporary. He was welcomed, celebrated, and almost immediately he began to feel out of place. The Petersburg literary world was sophisticated, Western-oriented, progressive. The writers and critics who gathered in salons and editorial offices were concerned with questions of aesthetics and social reform, with the role of literature in a rapidly modernizing society. They debated the merits of the natural school, the influence of French realism, the proper subject matter for the Russian novel. Tolstoy, fresh from the war, with his direct manner and his moral earnestness and his distrust of any kind of intellectual posturing, did not quite fit. He argued with Turgenev, who found him arrogant and boorish. He argued with the critics, who thought he was wasting his talent on didactic sketches when he should be writing great novels. He gambled, he drank, he was rude, and he was also acutely aware that he was performing some version of himself that felt false. In 1857, he left Russia for Western Europe, traveling through France, Switzerland, Italy, and Germany. It was his first extended trip abroad, and it confirmed many of his suspicions about European civilization. He found Paris vulgar and superficial. He witnessed a public execution by guillotine and was so horrified that he left the city almost immediately. He found the Swiss beautiful but smug, the Germans orderly but soulless. He met Proudhon in Brussels, attended lectures, visited museums, and came away with the conviction that Europe, for all its wealth and culture, had lost something essential, that it had traded the possibility of genuine community and genuine faith for material progress and empty sophistication. He returned to Russia in 1858 and went back to Yasnaya Polyana. He had been away, on and off, for years, and now he wanted to settle, to figure out what kind of life he could build for himself. He had money from his writing and from the estate, though the estate was still badly managed. He decided to focus on education. He opened a school for the peasant children on the estate, teaching them himself, developing his own methods, which were based on the idea that children learned best when they were free to follow their own interests rather than subjected to rote discipline. The school was chaotic, joyful, and probably not very effective by any conventional measure, but Tolstoy was convinced he was onto something. He traveled around the region, visiting other schools, observing other methods. He started a journal called Yasnaya Polyana, in which he published articles about education and rural life. He also continued to write fiction, though the output was sporadic. He wrote The Cossacks, a novella set in the Caucasus, about a young Russian nobleman who goes to the frontier seeking authenticity and finds himself utterly incapable of bridging the gap between his world and the world of the Cossacks. It is a work of piercing self-awareness, a portrait of a man who wants to shed his privilege and his civilized restraint, but who cannot, who remains always an outsider, watching. It was published in 1863 and was recognized as a major work, though it did not receive the same immediate acclaim as the Sevastopol sketches. In September of 1862, Tolstoy married Sofia Andreevna Burz, the daughter of a Moscow physician. She was 18 years old. He was 34. They had known each other since Sonya was a child. Her family spent summers near Yasnaya Polyana, and Tolstoy had watched her grow up with a kind of bemused affection that, in the summer of 1862, suddenly shifted into something more urgent. He proposed, and she accepted, and they were married quickly, before either of them had time to fully consider what they were agreeing to. The early years of the marriage were, by most accounts, happy. Sonya moved to Yasnaya Polyana, leaving behind the social life of Moscow for the isolation of the estate, and she threw herself into the role of wife and helped meet with an energy that bordered on devotion. She managed the household, supervised the servants, and, most importantly, she copied out Tolstoy's manuscripts. He wrote by hand in drafts that were chaotic and full of revisions, and Sonya would sit up late into the night transcribing his work, deciphering his handwriting, preparing clean copies for the publishers. She did this for War and Peace, for Anna Karenina, for all the major works of his middle period, and she did it while bearing and raising 13 children, 9 of whom survived infancy. Tolstoy, meanwhile, had begun the work that would define him. In 1863, he started writing War and Peace, a novel that would take him 6 years to complete, and that would, when it was finally published in full in 1869, establish him as one of the greatest novelists in the world. War and Peace is not easily summarized. It is a historical novel set during the Napoleonic Wars, following 5 aristocratic families, the Bezukhovs, the Bolkonskys, the Rostovs, the Kuragins, and the Drubetskoys through the years from 1805 to 1820. It is also a philosophical treatise on the nature of history and free will, interspersed with essays in which Tolstoy argues with historians and challenges the idea that great men shape events. It is a love story, several love stories, and a portrait of Russian society on the eve of transformation. It is a war novel that depicts battles in extraordinary detail. Austerlitz, Borodino, and also a domestic novel that spends long passages on the texture of daily life, on family dinners and name-day parties, and the small shifts in feeling that occur between two people sitting in a room. Tolstoy wrote it in sections, and the sections were published serially in a journal called The Russian Messenger, beginning in 1865. The early installments were titled The Year 1805, and they were well received, though readers were not quite sure what to make of the form. It was not like the novels of Turgenev or Goncharov, which followed a clear narrative arc. It sprawled, it digressed. It moved between battlefields and ballrooms with a kind of omnivorous attention, as though Tolstoy was determined to include everything, to render the full texture of life in all its complexity and contradiction. The central characters emerge slowly. There is Pierre Bezukhov, the illegitimate son of a wealthy count, who inherits a vast fortune and then spends the novel trying to figure out what to do with it, lurching between hedonism and mysticism and Freemasonry, and finally a kind of tentative acceptance of life as it is. There is Prince Andrei Bolkonsky, the proud and disillusioned officer who seeks glory and war and finds only futility, who falls in love and is betrayed, and is wounded, and spends the last section of the novel dying slowly, coming to a kind of peace that is both beautiful and terrifying. There is Natasha Rostova, who is introduced as a girl of 13 and who grows, over the course of the novel, into a woman of extraordinary vitality and emotional depth, whose capacity for life, for joy and sorrow and mistake and recovery becomes one of the novel's central values. And then there is the war itself, rendered not as a series of heroic set pieces, but as chaos. Tolstoy had served. He had been at Sevastopol, and he brought to the battle scenes a kind of ground-level realism that was unprecedented. He showed the confusion, the breakdown of orders, the way individual soldiers had no idea what was happening beyond their immediate field of vision. He showed commanders making decisions based on incomplete information and personal vanity. He argued in the essayistic sections that the outcome of battles was not determined by the plans of generals, but by the aggregate of thousands of individual actions, most of them uncoordinated, many of them accidental. History, he insisted, was not made by great men. It was made by everyone, and it was made almost blindly. This was a radical argument in 1865, and it remains a radical argument in 1865, and it remains a radical argument now. It stripped war of its glory and history of its coherence, and it suggested that the stories we tell ourselves about why things happen are largely fictions, constructed after the fact to impose order on chaos. And yet the novel itself is not chaotic. It is beautifully structured, its many threads woven together with a control that is all the more impressive for being largely invisible. Scenes echo across hundreds of pages. Characters who seem minor reappear at crucial moments. The domestic plot and the historical plot comment on each other without ever feeling schematic. The work was a triumph. By the time the final installments were published in 1869, Tolstoy was recognized not just as a major Russian writer, but as one of the great novelists of the age, spoken of in the same breath as Dickens and Balzac. War and Peace was unlike anything that had come before it. It was longer, more ambitious, more comprehensive. It was a total account of life, or as close to a total account as a novel could come, and it set a new standard for what the form could aspire to. And then, almost immediately, Tolstoy turned away from it. He did not disavow War and Peace, not yet, but he was restless. He had spent 6 years inside the world of the novel, and now he was out of it, and the world he returned to felt smaller and stranger. He was in his early 40s. He had a large family. The estate required attention. He was famous, and fame brought its own burdens, letters from admirers, visitors, requests for his opinion on various matters. He started and abandoned several projects. He studied Greek, reading Homer in the original. He became interested in education again, writing more articles, arguing with pedagogical theorists. In 1873, he began a new novel. It would be called Anna Karenina, and it would take him 4 years to write, and it would be, in the opinion of many readers and critics, the most perfectly constructed long novel ever written. Anna Karenina is narrower than War and Peace, more focused. It has no battles, no historical sweep. It is set in the contemporary Russia of the 1870s, in the world Tolstoy knew firsthand, the world of the Moscow and Petersburg aristocracy, of country estates and railway stations and social salons. It follows 2 parallel stories. One is the story of Anna, the beautiful and intelligent wife of a high-ranking government official, who falls in love with a dashing young officer named Vronsky and leaves her husband and her son to be with him, and who was then slowly destroyed by the social consequences of that choice. The other is the story of Konstantin Levin, a landowner who is searching for the meaning of life, who is awkward and earnest and prone to despair, who falls in love with Kitty Shorbatsky, and, after a long and painful courtship, marries her and tries to build a life based on work and family and some kind of faith he cannot quite articulate. The novel opens with one of the most famous lines in literature. All happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. It is a line that announces the novel's concern with marriage and domesticity, and also its method, which is to examine unhappiness with a particularity that borders on the clinical. The line is spoken by the narrator, but it could be spoken by Tolstoy himself, who by this point had been married for over a decade, and had come to understand that marriage was not the simple repository of happiness he had once imagined it to be. The first section introduces the Oblonsky household, where Anna's brother, Stiva, has been caught having an affair with the family's former governess, and his wife, Dolly, is devastated. Anna comes to Moscow from Petersburg to mediate, to soothe, to try to save the marriage. And while she is there, she meets Vronsky at a ball. The scene at the ball is one of the great set pieces of 19th-century fiction. Kitty, who is in love with Vronsky and believes he is about to propose, watches as he dances with Anna, watches as something shifts between them, as Anna, almost against her will, becomes radiant, magnetic, and Vronsky, who had been courting Kitty out of a kind of idle interest, is suddenly, irrevocably captivated. Kitty sees it all, understands it all, and the night that was supposed to be her triumph becomes the night of her humiliation. Anna returns to Petersburg to her husband Alexei Alexandrovich Karenin, a cold and meticulous man who cares more about his career and his reputation than about his wife, and to her son Seryozha, whom she loves with a fierce, uncomplicated tenderness. She tries to resume her life, but Vronsky follows her, and the affair begins, conducted in secret, in snatched meetings, in the coded language of glances and letters. Anna becomes pregnant. She confesses to her husband, who is less devastated by the betrayal than by the public embarrassment it threatens. He refuses to divorce her, refuses to let her see her son, and makes it clear that if she leaves him, she will be cast out of society entirely. She leaves anyway. She and Vronsky go to Italy for a time, and they are happy, or something like happy. But when they return to Russia, the reality of her position becomes clear. She cannot appear in public without scandal. She cannot see her son. Vronsky, who loves her, is also chafing under the constraints of their life together. He is a man of the world, and he wants to be in the world, and Anna's exile from society is also, increasingly, his exile. He goes to his estate, he takes up administrative duties, he tries to fill his days, but he is restless, and Anna, isolated and increasingly paranoid, begins to suspect that he does not love her as much as she loves him, that he resents her, that he will leave her. The final section of her story is almost unbearable. She takes laudanum to sleep and to calm her nerves, and her perceptions become distorted. She picks fights with Vronsky over nothing, or over everything. She goes to a performance at the theater and is publicly snubbed, and the humiliation is so acute that she can barely function. She writes Vronsky a note summoning him, and when he does not come immediately, she convinces herself that he has abandoned her, that he never loved her, that her life is over. She goes to the railway station. She sees a train approaching, and she throws herself under it. Her death is rendered with a terrible clarity. Tolstoy does not look away. He shows the moment of decision, the brief flash of regret, the impact. It is not romanticized. It is simply final. The parallel story, Levin's story, is the opposite of Anna's in almost every way. Where Anna's life spirals inward, narrowing toward destruction, Levin's life spirals outward, opening toward something that might be called meaning, though it is fragile and provisional. Levin is often understood as Tolstoy's stand-in, and the resemblance is not subtle. He is a landowner. He is preoccupied with agricultural reform. He is awkward in social situations. He is searching for faith. He proposes to Kitty early in the novel and is rejected, and the rejection plunges him into despair. He retreats to his estate, works the fields alongside the peasants, tries to lose himself in physical labor. He writes a book about agriculture. He argues with his brother Nikolai, who is dying slowly of tuberculosis and who challenges Levin's faith in progress and rationality. Levin eventually proposes to Kitty again, and this time she accepts. They marry, and the novel spends a long section on their early married life, on the adjustments and misunderstandings and small reconciliations that make up a relationship. Kitty becomes pregnant. She gives birth, and Levin, who had been terrified, is overwhelmed by a feeling he cannot name, a sense of connection to something larger than himself. But he is still searching. He is still asking the question that has haunted him throughout the novel: how to live. What is the point of all this? The work, the family, the striving, if it all ends in death. He considers suicide. He hides the rope so he will not hang himself. And then, in the final pages, he has a conversation with a peasant on his estate who explains in simple terms that some people live for their own needs, and some people live for their own needs, and some people live for their own needs, and some people live for God, for their soul, for truth. And Levin, hearing this, feels something shift. He does not suddenly acquire faith. He does not have a vision. But he understands, or begins to understand, that the meaning of life is not something to be discovered through reason. It is something to be lived in the daily actions of caring for others, of working, of paying attention. It is not an answer. It is a practice. The novel ends with Levin looking up at the sky, at the stars, feeling both the immensity of the universe and the smallness of his own life, and finding in that juxtaposition not despair but a kind of peace. Anna Karenina was published serially in The Russian Messenger between 1875 and 1877, and it was immediately recognized as a masterpiece. Dostoevsky called it a flawless work of art. Readers were devastated by Anna's fate and moved by Levin's search. The novel was more controlled than War and Peace, more focused, and its emotional range was, if anything, even greater. It captured the way lives unfold in parallel, the way one person's tragedy and another person's tentative happiness can coexist in the same world, even in the same novel, without one invalidating the other. And yet, even as he was finishing it, Tolstoy was changing. The questions that Levin asks in the novel were questions Tolstoy was asking himself, and the tentative peace that Levin asks in the novel were questions Tolstoy was asking himself, and the tentative peace that Levin finds at the end was not, for Tolstoy, sufficient. He wanted more. He wanted an answer that would not dissolve under scrutiny. In 1879, 2 years after Anna Karenina was completed, Tolstoy experienced what he would later describe as a spiritual crisis. He was 51 years old. He was wealthy, famous, healthy, surrounded by family. By any external measure, his life was a success, and yet he was overcome by a sense of meaninglessness so acute that he considered suicide. He described this crisis in a short work called A Confession, written in 1882, in which he recounts how he came to the realization that the life he had been living, the life of the educated, privileged, secular intellectual, was empty, that all the things he had valued, art, fame, reason, progress, were distractions from the only question that mattered, which was, why live? He turned to religion. He had been nominally orthodox his entire life, but he had not been devout. Now he began to study the Gospels with an intensity that alarmed his family and friends. He learned Hebrew and Greek so he could read the texts in their original languages. He wrote essays and treatises arguing that the Church had distorted the teachings of Jesus, that Christianity, as it was practiced in Russia, was a corrupt amalgamation of ritual and superstition that had nothing to do with the simple ethical message at the heart of the Gospels. He distilled that message into 5 commandments, which he believed were the core of Jesus' teaching. Do not be angry, do not commit adultery, do not take oaths, do not resist evil with violence, and love your enemies. These commandments, he argued, were not metaphors. They were instructions. And if one took them seriously, if one tried to live by them, then the entire structure of modern life government, the military, the law, private property, was revealed as incompatible with Christianity. The state, which claimed the right to use violence to enforce its will, was unchristian. The Church, which blessed the state's violence and accumulated wealth, was unchristian. The life of the aristocracy, with its luxury and its exploitation of the peasantry, was unchristian. And Tolstoy, who had spent his life as a member of that aristocracy, who had participated in its privileges and enjoyed its comforts, was unchristian. He decided to change. The decision was not sudden. It unfolded over the course of the 1880s as Tolstoy's beliefs became more radical and his behavior more extreme. He gave away the copyrights to his works published after 1881, declaring that literature should not be a source of profit. He dressed in peasant clothes, loose linen shirts and wide trousers and a belt. He learned to cobble shoes, to plow fields, to chop wood. He adopted a vegetarian diet. He stopped drinking, stopped smoking, stopped hunting. He tried to give away his estate, but his wife, Sonia, refused to allow it. The estate was their children's inheritance, she argued. He could not simply renounce it on behalf of everyone. The conflict between Tolstoy and Sonia became one of the central dramas of his later years. Sonia had spent 20 years supporting his manuscripts, managing the household, raising their children. She had sacrificed her own ambitions and her own comfort for his sake. And now he was declaring that everything they had built together was sinful, that their life of relative comfort was incompatible with Christian virtue, and that he wanted to live like a peasant. She was furious. She was heartbroken. She wrote in her diary that he was abandoning his family, that his new faith was destroying them, that he was a hypocrite who preached renunciation but still lived in a large house and ate food prepared by servants. She was not wrong. Tolstoy's position was contradictory. He wanted to live as a peasant, but he did not actually work the land for his living. He wanted to renounce his wealth, but he continued to live at Yasnaya Polyana, which was maintained by the labor of others. He preached nonviolence, but his pronouncements were protected by his fame and his social position, which insulated him from the consequences that an ordinary person might face for expressing such radical views. He was, in many ways, a figure of profound privilege attempting to renounce privilege while still benefiting from it, and the tension between his beliefs and his circumstances was something he was acutely aware of and could never fully resolve. The works he wrote during this period reflect that tension. He turned away from fiction, or tried to. He wrote essays and treatises, What I Believe, The Kingdom of God is Within You, What is Art?, in which he laid out his religious and moral philosophy. He argued that most of what passed for art was decadent, that it served only to amuse the upper classes and had no moral value. He renounced his own earlier works, including War and Peace and Anna Karenina, declaring that they were products of his sinful past, that they were not true art, because they did not help people live better lives. True art, he argued, should communicate moral truths in simple, accessible language. It should be comprehensible to a peasant. It should inspire people to love one another and to live according to Christian principles. These arguments were met with outrage and bewilderment. How could the man who wrote Anna Karenina dismiss it as worthless? How could the author of War and Peace, the novel that had set the standard for the form's ambition, declare that literature should be simple and didactic? Critics accused him of hypocrisy, of ingratitude, of losing his mind. Some saw his turn to religion as a retreat from the complexity of his earlier work. Others saw it as the inevitable conclusion of the questions he had been asking all along. But he did continue to write fiction, despite his claims that he had renounced it. He wrote The Death of Ivan Ilyich, a novella about a middle-aged judge who becomes terminally ill and, in his dying, confronts the emptiness of the life he has led. In his dying, confronts the emptiness of the life he has led. It is one of the most harrowing accounts of mortality in literature, rendered with an almost clinical precision. Even Ilyich's pain is physical and existential. He realizes too late that he has lived according to the expectations of others, that he has pursued status and comfort instead of anything real, and the realization is unbearable. The story ends with Ivan's death, which comes as a kind of release, a final letting go of the ego that has been clinging to life out of fear and pride. He wrote the Kreutzer Sonata, a novella about a man who murders his wife in a jealous rage and then recounts his story to a fellow passenger on a train. The narrator is deeply disturbed, consumed by guilt and anger and a kind of wild misogynistic philosophy that sees sexual desire as the root of all evil. The work was controversial, banned for a time, read as both a condemnation of marriage and a critique of the sexual hypocrisy of bourgeois society. Tolstoy's views on sex had become extreme. He believed that chastity, even within marriage, was the ideal, that sexual desire was a distraction from spiritual life. Sonia read the Kreutzer Sonata as a repudiation of their own marriage, and she was devastated. He wrote Resurrection, a long novel about a nobleman named Nekhlyudov, who serves on a jury and recognizes the defendant, a prostitute accused of murder, as a woman he had seduced years earlier when she was a servant in his aunt's house. He had ruined her, and then he had forgotten about her, and now he is confronted with the consequences of his actions. The novel follows his attempts to redeem himself, to save her, to reform the legal system, to make amends. It is didactic in a way that Anna Karenina and War and Peace are not. The characters are often mouthpieces for Tolstoy's views on law, on property, on the church, on the social order. The narrative is less controlled, more sprawling. But there are moments of extraordinary power, moments when Tolstoy's gift for rendering the inner life of his characters breaks through the didacticism, and the reader is reminded that this is the same man who wrote Anna's death and Levin's search. The later years of his life are marked by increasing conflict within his family and increasing celebrity beyond it. Tolstoy had become a kind of secular saint, a figure of moral authority who attracted pilgrims from around the world. People came to Yasnaya Polyana to meet him, to ask his advice, to be in the presence of the great man. He received hundreds of letters. He was photographed, interviewed, written about. His disciples, Tolstoyans, they were called, formed communities based on his teachings, attempting to live without violence, without property, without participation in the state. But at home, the atmosphere was often bitter. Sonia was exhausted and angry. She felt that he had betrayed her, that his philosophy was destroying their family. She argued with him constantly, sometimes in front of visitors, and he, for all his preaching about nonviolence and love, was often cold and impatient with her. Their children were caught in the middle, some siding with their father, some with their mother, all of them damaged by the conflict. Tolstoy wrote in his diary that he felt trapped, that he wanted to leave, to live in poverty, to strip away the last remnants of his privileged life. But he stayed. Year after year, he stayed. In October of 1910, at the age of 82, Tolstoy finally left. He left in the middle of the night, taking only a few belongings, accompanied by his doctor and his youngest daughter, Alexandra. He did not tell Sonia where he was going. He boarded a train heading south with no clear destination. He was ill. He had been ill for some time, and the journey, the cold, the stress, made him worse. After a few days, he developed pneumonia. He was taken off the train at a small station called Ostapovo, and he was moved into the station master's house, where he lay dying, in a narrow room, surrounded by family members who had rushed to be with him and journalists who had gathered outside to report on the death of the great writer. Sonia came. She was not allowed to see him at first. Alexandra and the doctor kept her away, fearing that her presence would agitate him. When she was finally admitted to the room, he was unconscious. He died on November 7, 1910, without waking, without speaking to her. The death became an international event. Newspapers around the world ran front-page obituaries. Thousands of people attended his funeral at Yasnaya Polyana. Even though the church refused to bless the service, he had been excommunicated in 1901 for his criticisms of orthodoxy. He was buried in a simple grave in the woods on the estate, in a spot he had chosen years earlier, marked by a small mound of earth and no headstone. In the years after his death, the fight over his legacy began. Sonia and Alexandra each claimed to represent his true wishes. The Tolstoyans continued to preach his philosophy of nonviolence and Christian anarchism. The Soviet government, when it came to power, appropriated Tolstoy as a critic of the old order, while quietly suppressing his religious writings. His novels, War and Peace and Anna Karenina, continued to be read, and they achieved a kind of canonical status, taught in schools, translated into every major language, held up as models of what the novel could be. But the novels exist in an uneasy relationship with the man who wrote them. Tolstoy himself renounced them, declared them sinful, insisted that they were products of a life he had tried to leave behind, and yet they endure, and they endure because they contain a truth that Tolstoy's later moral philosophy does not. The novels do not preach, they do not simplify, they do not offer answers, they render life in all its complexity, its contradictions, its beauty and cruelty and mystery. They show people struggling to live, making mistakes, seeking meaning, and sometimes finding it, and sometimes not. War and Peace is vast, but it is not chaotic. It is full of life, but it is also full of death. It shows battles and ballrooms, love and betrayal, birth and dying, and it holds all of these things in a kind of suspension without resolving them into a single coherent message. It suggests, in its structure and its method, that life is too large to be captured by any one perspective, that the truth of any moment is the sum of all the perspectives brought to bear on it, and that the novel, as a form, can come closer to that truth than any other art. Anna Karenina is narrower, but it is no less profound. It shows two ways of living: Anna's, which is passionate and doomed, and Levin's, which is awkward and searching and ultimately open to grace, and it does not choose between them. It does not say that Anna was wrong to leave her husband, or that Levin was right to stay on his estate. It shows what happens, and it lets the reader sit with the consequences, and the feeling that lingers after the novel ends is not one of moral clarity, but of a deep, unsettling awareness of the difficulty of being alive. The later works, the didactic works, the essays and treatises, are less successful because they try to impose clarity where none exists. They try to reduce life to a set of principles that can be followed, and in doing so, they lose the texture, the ambiguity, the human particularity that makes the novels so powerful. Tolstoy believed that he had moved beyond the novels, that he had found the truth in the Gospels, and that his earlier works were distractions from that truth. But the novels suggest otherwise. They suggest that the truth is not a destination but a process, not a set of principles, but a sustained attention to the way people actually live. The contradiction at the heart of Tolstoy's life: the aristocrat who wanted to be a peasant, the novelist who renounced his novels, the man of privilege who preached renunciation but could not fully live it, is the same contradiction that gives his work its power. He was always trying to bridge the gap between the world as it was and the world as he believed it should be, and he was always failing, and the failure was not a weakness, it was the condition of his work. The novels do not try to solve the problem of how to live. They try to show what living looks like in all its mess and difficulty and occasional beauty, and that is enough. It has to be. After his death, Sonia lived for another 9 years, editing his papers, defending his reputation, trying to make sense of the life they had shared. She published her own diaries, which offer a counterpoint to his, a portrait of a marriage that was as fraught and complicated as any marriage in his novels. Alexandra became the keeper of the Tolstoyan flame, preserving Yasnaya Polyana, promoting his philosophy, eventually fleeing Russia after the revolution and living out her life in exile. Promoting his philosophy. Eventually fleeing, beventuade hout her bekeld. The estate remained, and it became a museum. Visitors could walk through the rooms where Tolstoy had lived and worked, see his desk, his books, the simple wooden furniture he had made with his own hands. The peasant school was preserved, the birch groves and the fields and the long approach through the gates were maintained, and they looked much as they had when Tolstoy was alive, as though time had paused at Yasnaya Polyana, waiting for him to return. But of course he did not return. He was buried in the woods, in the spot he had chosen, and the grave became a site of pilgrimage for those who believed in his teachings, and for those who simply wanted to pay their respects to one of the great writers. The grave is still there, a mound of earth, no headstone, surrounded by trees, quiet. The novels continued to be read. War and Peace was translated and retranslated, adapted for film and television, taught in universities, discussed in seminars, held up as the pinnacle of the form. Readers came to it expecting a kind of monument, and they found instead something stranger and more alive, a book that sprawled and digressed, and included too much, and somehow, in its excess, captured something essential about the experience of being human. Anna Karenina was read as a tragedy, and it is a tragedy, but it is also more than that. It is a portrait of a society in transition, a world in which the old certainties about marriage, about class, about duty, were beginning to crack, and no one knew what would replace them. Anna's death is devastating, but it is not the end of the novel. The novel ends with Levin standing under the stars, trying to figure out how to live. And that image, the solitary man, searching, uncertain, but not defeated, is as central to Tolstoy's vision as Anna's death. The later works, the moral writings, found an audience too, though a different one. Tolstoy's ideas about nonviolence influenced Gandhi, who read "The kingdom of God is within you," while he was a young lawyer in South Africa and found in it a philosophical justification for the strategy of passive resistance that he would later deploy in India. Martin Luther King Jr. read Tolstoy and cited him as an influence. The Tolstoyan communities, which had formed during his lifetime, continued for a few decades after his death, though most of them eventually disbanded. The philosophy was too demanding, the renunciations too total, and the world was not inclined to accommodate those who refused to participate in its structures. But the ideas persisted, even if the communities did not. Tolstoy's critique of the state, of violence, of the accumulation of wealth, of the hypocrisy of institutional Christianity, remained relevant, and his insistence that the only meaningful response to the world's injustice was to change one's own life, to live according to one's principles, even if it was difficult, and even if it was futile, resonated with those who were dissatisfied with the compromises required by modern life. And yet, the novels outlasted the philosophy. The novels were read by people who did not care about Tolstoy's religious beliefs, who did not share his views on nonviolence or vegetarianism or chastity, who simply wanted to read a great story told by a master. The novels did not require the reader to agree with anything. They only required attention, a willingness to enter the world they created, and to stay there for as long as it took to reach the end. War and Peace and Anna Karenina are, in different ways, accounts of how people live in time, how they change and grow and diminish, how they are shaped by forces beyond their control, and also by the small, daily choices they make. They are novels of epic scope and intimate detail, novels that move between the largest questions. How does history happen? What is the meaning of life, and the smallest moments a glance across a room? A child's laugh, the feel of grass underfoot. They do not resolve these scales into a single vision. They hold them in tension, and that tension is what makes them great. Tolstoy spent his life trying to find the truth, and he believed at the end that he had found it in the Gospels, in the command to love one another and to renounce violence and to live simply. But the novels suggest that the truth is not singular, that it is not something that can be stated in a sentence or followed as a rule. The novels suggest that the truth is something that emerges in the act of living, in the texture of experience, in the way one person's life intersects with another's, in the accumulation of days and choices and mistakes and moments of grace. He was a man of contradictions, and he knew it. He was a nobleman who wanted to be a peasant, a sensualist who preached chastity, a novelist who renounced the novel, a Christian who was excommunicated by the church. He was a husband who loved his wife, and also made her life unbearable. He was a father who loved his children and also put them in an impossible position. He was a moralist who could not live up to his own standards, and he was aware of the failure, and he kept trying anyway. The trying, the striving, the refusal to accept the world as it was, that is what animates his work. The novels are not sermons. They are investigations. They ask, what is it like to be alive? What is it like to love someone, to lose someone, to search for meaning, to fail, to keep going? And they answer not with statements but with scenes, with characters who breathe and suffer and change, with a narrative that unfolds over hundreds of pages and thousands of details, and somehow, at the end, leaves the reader with the sense that life, for all its difficulty, is worth the attention it demands. Tolstoy died in a railway station, far from home, having finally made the break he had been threatening to make for years. It is a strange, lonely end for a man who had been surrounded by family and fame for most of his life, but it is also, in a way, fitting. He was always trying to escape, to shed the privilege and the complications and the weight of his own history, to find a simpler, purer way of living. He never found it. The escape was incomplete, the renunciation imperfect, the principles impossible to fully live. But he kept moving toward them, right up until the end, and the novels remain. They sit on shelves in libraries and homes, translated into dozens of languages, read by millions of people over more than a century. They are not easy books. They are long. They require patience. They do not offer the satisfactions of a tidy plot or a clear moral. But they offer something else, something rarer, a vision of life that is large enough to contain contradiction, that is honest enough to admit ambiguity, that is attentive enough to capture the texture of experience in all its strangeness and beauty and pain. Tolstoy wanted to save the world. He wanted to teach people how to live, to free them from the lies of society and the church and the state, to lead them to a life of simplicity and faith. He failed, but in failing, in the act of trying and failing and trying again, he created something that has outlasted his philosophy and his reputation and his life. He created 2 novels that are, in their scope and their depth and their humanity, as close as any work of art has come to capturing the full complexity of what it means to be alive. That is the legacy, not the renunciation, not the philosophy, not the myth of the man who gave everything away, but the work itself, the patient, sustained, almost obsessive attention to life in all its forms, rendered on the page with a clarity and a compassion that few writers have ever matched. He was Leo Tolstoy, and he wrote War and Peace and Anna Karenina, and that is enough.